Greetings. Hello once again, Mount Calvary Church, Mount Calvary Christian School students. Mr. Howlett back with you again as we continue our study through 1 Corinthians. We're making a bit of a transition here in the book. Joe mentioned this yesterday, that Paul has finished his introduction to the book, and now he is moving into those sections where he is going to be dealing with specific issues that the Corinthian church is facing. There has been correspondence between Paul and the Corinthian church prior to this, and he is very familiar with that church, having spent some time there. So now we're moving into specific areas that he's going to deal with. So our first specific issue that he deals with is in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, which is our text for today. It is only 13 verses, so a pretty short chapter. But please take the time now to pause the video and to read through 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 1 through 13. Go ahead. Now that you've read through 1 Corinthians chapter 5, you'll notice the subject isn't necessarily a great one. There is a person who is actively involved in the church who is having some inappropriate relations with his father's wife. It appears to be his stepmother, as it were. But either way, this is going on in the church, and so Paul is addressing this issue specifically. You'll notice in verses 1 through 5 that Paul gives his ruling. He says what's going on here is inappropriate, it's unacceptable, it is sin, and it should not be tolerated. You'll notice in verses 6 through 8 that he gives an analogy of the Passover. I'd like to read those three verses because they relate to what our big idea is for today. Starting in verse 6, your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast that you may be a new batch without yeast, as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. And so in these verses, Paul gives an analogy that would have been very familiar to them as it relates to Passover. And so at Passover, it was customary that they would eat unleavened bread. And obviously, from the text, Paul says that Jesus is their Passover lamb. And so he is advising them, he is equating yeast with sin. And so he is saying even a little bit of sin, if tolerated, if left unchecked, continues to grow and to multiply. And so he wants them to be very swift and decisive in eliminating the sin that's among them. And that relates to what he says in verses 9 through 13. And you'll notice how this chapter ends in verse 13. It says, expel the wicked man from among you. So our big idea for today is, do you surround yourself with good influences or bad influences? Do you surround yourself with people that are an encouragement to you spiritually, or those that sin and in turn tempt you to sin? Paul is clear. He doesn't want them to boast and think, oh, well, we can handle this, it's no big deal. It's interesting as you study the church at Corinth, the city itself was an extremely wicked, sexually sinful city, full of evil and prostitution and worship that was extremely, extremely wicked. They sought pleasure, and that's all they really cared about. And so Paul is telling them, no, this is a serious issue for you. You need to expel this immoral brother from you. Now, most of us are not in charge of a church. We are not responsible for a flock, and so we're not really going to kick people out of our church. But for us, our application as we think about today is, are there people in your life that are bringing yeast with them, that they sin in certain ways that are a great temptation for you to sin. And so we really need to be cautious the kind of people that we surround ourselves with. Now, I know you might think, well, we're in quarantine now and nobody's going out, but we all know there is still plenty of social interaction. There is still plenty of opportunities for people to tempt one another to sin. And so I want to challenge you today to pray in a moment and ask God to reveal to you if there is a relationship that you have in your life that is not healthy for your spiritual walk. And my challenge for you today is, as difficult as it might be, to eliminate that relationship, or at the very least have a conversation with that individual about how they are being a negative influence to you. So take some time now to pray and to ask God, and ask God for the strength and courage that if there is a relationship that you need to end, that you would have the strength to do so. I'm praying for you, and I hope that this will be a time where we are serious about our holiness and serious about removing sin from our lives. Have a good day, and we'll see you next time.